Hi everyone, Dreki here, and today I'm reviewing the Vantop Moment 5C. This is a real 4K action cam from Vantop, which they sent me to review. So we'll be going over the video quality, performance, all that sort of important stuff, and see whether or not this camera is worth your hard-earned money. Vantop's always had really nice retail packaging, the kind of thing I'd expect to see on a store shelf instead of from an online seller. Reminds me of the older GoPros with the clear top and all the accessories in the base below. So let's get those on the table now. Let's go over what's included in the box. It's about what you'd expect to get with a $100 action camera. Of course, included are the camera and a waterproof case. There are 2 batteries and a charger. That's a nice inclusion. Remote, mounts, a couple extra bits just in case. Quality on the mounting hardware, well, seems functional. Everything clicks together quite nicely and holds solid, so yeah, that'll do the trick. Now let's get this off the table and look at the camera itself.
The build quality of the 5C is above standard. This camera is made from a textured plastic that feels fairly lightweight to hold, but it is solid with no gaps in the construction. The battery door is on a hinge as well, meaning that it won't get lost. And the best part of this camera is there are still buttons. While several cameras have moved to a full touchscreen UI, the 5C retains its physical buttons, which makes sense, since this camera is not waterproof without its waterproof case, and when it's in the waterproof case, the touchscreen isn't really usable. Speaking of the user interface, the UI of this camera, it's about as good as they get. Swipe left and right from the main screen to switch modes, or use this gear icon to pull up the settings menu, where it is then broken down into photo or video settings and overall camera settings. The user interface, it's pretty standard these days, but it is thoughtfully laid out and straightforward to navigate, whether you're using touch or the buttons. 2 things to note though, you can only scroll 1 page at a time with your fingers, there's no single item scrolling. Also, there doesn't appear to be any quick launch button to launch the settings out of the main screen. You either have to do it on the touchscreen or use the front menu button a couple times to get into the settings. This camera also cannot do lens distortion correction at the same time as image stabilization, but the option is there if you choose one or the other. So now let's check out the video quality. This is a daytime sample at 4K 30 frames per second, which I think is the best format that this camera films. Just a note though, if you want to check out the different video qualities, I've put that at the end of the video because it's like 4 minutes long and it's pretty bland. So I'll put a timestamp in right now, and if you want to just see video quality comparisons, skip to that timestamp. Otherwise, keep on watching and we'll do a quick overview of everything here. Vantop claims that this camera can do 4K at 60 frames per second, and it's true that it does output a 60 FPS file at 4K resolution. But the video quality isn't as high as I'd expect for 4K, there's just not as much detail as there should be. That's kind of to be expected from a camera of this caliber, seeing as it is under $100, 4K at 60 frames per second is pretty tough to do. And when you compare it to a higher end camera such as Vantop's Moment 6S, yeah, the lack of detail is pretty obvious. There's also an option for 4K 60 with EIS in the menu, but the results it produces are, let's just say, not usable. So I'm kind of surprised that it was even included. When it comes to 4K 30 though, results are pretty good overall. Colors are bright and vibrant, the exposure is decent, albeit a little bit on the dark side sometimes. And I find the amount of detail is pretty good overall, albeit a little bit of crunchiness and compression noise around some detailed objects. For the most part though, unless you're pixel peeping, 4K 30 will be more than adequate. As with most budget action cameras, the Moment 5C likes a lot of light, so your best results will be had in sunlight or with the camera mounted to something steady like a tripod, or even hand holding it without shaking it too much. There is an anti-shake mode with the camera and it's pretty rudimentary, we'll talk about that more in a little bit, but even that works best in daylight. So for example, I found that cycling on the street or playing in the swimming pool in direct sunlight produced excellent quality video, whereas riding in the forest where it's always kind of dark, made video that's slightly grainy, blurred, and noisy. To me, it appears this camera favors a lower overall ISO versus a faster shutter speed, which means in less than ideal lighting, you'll end up with less than ideal video quality just because things get a little bit blurry. Having the camera mounted on a tripod or a gimbal, that'll result in the best quality overall. There is also an auto low light setting, which in 60 FPS hard locks the camera to that minimum shutter speed. It's just exchanged for darker video so things don't get as shaky, and I would suggest using that if possible. This is on par with most cameras at its price point, and don't get me wrong, the Moment 5C has better quality than several other cameras at this price point. Using 60 FPS mode in the dark forest scene does help video quality somewhat, as the camera locks itself to a 1/60th of a second shutter speed. However, as you'll see in the next shot, there is a trade-off in detail that's pretty significant when using a 60 FPS mode and EIS. So this is 1080p 60 now, and as you can see, it's a little bit more blocky than it should be. I'll show you a 1080p 30 shot, and then the same shot in 1080p 60. And as you can see, there is a drop in detail between 30 FPS and 60 FPS. So that format isn't as usable as I would like. Again, all of these things are pretty on par with other cameras at its price point. As things start to get darker, as I mentioned, it'll get a little bit more blurry, especially if you have the image stabilization turned off. Shut it off for best results, but again, unless you're under pretty bright light, you're not going to see much at night. The Vantop Moment 5C has an auto low light function, but it doesn't seem to be available in 30 frames per second modes, only the 60 FPS modes. I suggest turning the electronic image stabilization off, otherwise your night video is going to look like, well, this. Very dark, hard to see anything. So now we're in that same situation, 1080p 30 with EIS turned off. When EIS is turned on, you're sort of hard locked to a faster shutter speed in order to get better quality. And you can see now that it's not actually fully dark out. 10 PM, not fully dark out. Audio quality with this camera is actually really good. It's rare that I can go out into the world and film without bringing an external microphone that's attached to my cell phone. With the 5C outside of its waterproof case, things are easy to hear, and sometimes if you get too close to the camera it can even get too loud. There's no adjustment for mic sensitivity in this camera, what you hear is what you get, but for the most part it does a pretty good job, again, as long as things aren't too loud. Hi everyone, Dreki here, and in my hands I'm filming with the Vantop Moment 5C, a real 4K action cam that features 4K 30 frames per second with EIS and a basic 4K 60 mode. So this is supposedly 4K 60 with electronic image stabilization turned on. So there's definitely EIS, but something's a bit up with the resolution there. And there you go, there's 4K 60 without EIS, and as you can see, it is significantly better. I don't even know why they have the setting for 4K 60 EIS in the menu, it just doesn't work. Nonetheless, the 4K 60 itself is a little bit, shall we say, not as good resolution as it should be, compared to especially the 4K 30, 4K 30 EIS, and even the 2.7K 1080p 60 modes. Anyone who's been following my channel for a while might recognize this park from about 2 or 3 years ago. This is by my house back in Canada, and, well, I'm back in Canada. Nonetheless, this is going to test microphone synchronization because we're looking at about 3 to 5 minutes of video here, just to see how it goes. The camera's just mounted to a chest mount, nothing special going on here. But I always want to do this shot because this is a very vibrating trail due to this bark mulch. Makes it hard to hold the camera steady. And then we go from this nice light patch here into a darker patch when we go up the hill. This always challenges the EIS on these cameras to see whether or not they can go from light to dark, how this transition is, that sort of thing. Alright, and we are well past the 3-minute mark, which is a good point for a microphone synchronization test. I have this camera left on its default settings, and if this is in sync, that's a good thing, but I have no idea whether or not it's going to be. Alright, today it's a nice sunny day, so let's go out and do some comparisons between the Vantop Moment 5C and their more expensive camera, the 6S. I'm gonna go take some video of flowers, I think. Find some cherry blossoms, maybe? Alright, today it's a nice sunny day, so let's go out and do some comparisons between the Vantop Moment 5C and their more expensive camera, the 6S. I'm gonna go take some video of flowers, I think. Find some cherry blossoms, maybe?
I thought we'd start by taking a look at the 4K 60 mode for both of these cameras. The Moment 6S, the more expensive camera, has real 4K 60 well. The 5C, it's a little bit more questionable in terms of the actual resolution. If you're watching on a small screen, it'll be really hard to tell, but look at a bigger screen and you'll see the difference in actual quality. So really neither of these cameras have image stabilization in 4K 60. The Moment 5C has a setting you can turn on that enables image stabilization. However, as you'll see in a moment, it cuts the resolution into like 1/4, hardly even 1080p. So there's no point in using it when the resolution is so bad. Yeah. Looking in the other direction, there's a whole bunch of really fancy houses, water features, that sort of stuff. And here I am just looking at a green park. So one thing I'm confused about with the Vantop Moment 5C is where it's supposed to fit in Vantop's line. I understand that a lot of sellers hype up their cameras by saying they can do a little bit better than they actually can, and in order to be competitive you kind of need to do that these days, especially in the low end. But the problem I have with the Moment 5C is it interferes with the 6S. What I mean by that is both cameras are advertised as doing 4K 60, while only one of the two cameras is real 4K 60. If I was a layperson, I didn't know about action cams, I'd go for the cheaper one over the more expensive one because I wouldn't know the difference. And that's where the real trouble comes in. Why would you sell a cheaper camera with the same or apparently better specification than the more expensive camera? One of the places I noticed the most difference between the high and mid-end action cameras is in 1080p 60, which is kind of funny because you'd think cheaper cameras would be optimized for 1080p 60, but these days everyone is pushing for that high resolution 4K 30, so they tend to be optimized for that instead. So let's take a look at the difference between the 1080p 60 on the 5C and the more expensive 6S, and you'll see what I mean. Alright, next up let's compare the Vantop Moment 5C with the Akaso V50 Pro, which I honestly thought would be more similar than they actually are in terms of video quality. Alright, next up let's compare the Vantop Moment 5C with the Akaso V50 Pro, which I honestly thought would be more similar than they actually are in terms of video quality. But they're kinda not. They're very different cameras. The 5C allegedly offers 4K 60, and the original V50 Pro, well, it's only max 4K 30. I think there is the V50 Pro SE, which is probably more similar to the 5C in terms of actual video quality. I'm guessing the V50 Pro SE would be more similar to the Vantop Moment 5C just because the V50 Pro SE also offers 4K 60, but I'm guessing that the 4K 60 on that camera is similarly upscaled to the 5C just because I haven't seen a real 4K 60 cam under $100 yet.
This camera supposedly does up to 20 megapixel still photos from an image sensor that's only 12 megapixels. Quality of still photos, it's very good for an action cam. However, using the 20 megapixel mode, it's kind of a waste of memory card space as it's clearly in upscale. The closest mode with actual sensor resolution in the camera settings is 14 megapixel. There is no 12 megapixel mode, so that's the one I stuck with and I suggest you do too. Again, as with video, there's pleasing and vibrant colors, high saturation, and actually a decent dynamic range. Just one thing though, if you point directly at the sun, get ready for some intense lens flares. When it comes to electronic image stabilization, the 5C is pretty middle of the road. At 1080p 30 or 4K 30, the camera holds solid to the center of the frame with few stabilization artifacts. This is perfect for light-duty applications such as handheld video, some chest mount footage, or with the camera on the handlebar on the road. However, it does fall short of being able to stabilize harder, bumpier footage like handlebar on the trails, some helmet mounts, or anything that gets seriously shaky. In general, only high-end cameras such as GoPro can do that effectively, so again, it's another area where the 5C performs as expected. So overall, when it comes to the Moment 5C, yeah, the video is a little bit chunky at times and the 60 FPS modes could be better, but this is pretty on par with other cameras at its price point. Some things I really like about it: the audio quality is good, stabilization's pretty good, and the video quality results in bright, pleasing colors. If you're not a pixel peeper and not too worried about a little bit of crunchiness around details, it's a pretty solid camera overall, especially at 1080p 30. So hey, thanks for watching. If you have any questions about this camera, please leave them in the comments below. And stay tuned because the next 4 minutes is just going to be video quality comparisons, and if you're not interested in watching that, make sure to give this video a thumbs up before you leave. Like, share, subscribe. I appreciate all of your support. This is a resolution comparison and test with the Vantop Moment 5C. On the left side is a full frame and on the right side is a close crop, so those of you watching on smaller screens can see the difference in detail between different settings. We'll start from the top down with 4K 60 and Electronic Image Stabilization, EIS, turned off. And then here it is, same thing, 4K 60 with EIS turned on. Historically speaking, turning on EIS does reduce image quality somewhat, but it is clear that this camera cannot do a true 4K 60 with EIS on, so I'm unsure why that option is available in the menu. Now 4K 30, no EIS. Notice there are a lot more fine details around the leaves, especially compared to the 4K 60 modes. And then 4K 30 with the EIS turned on, which I think is the highest resolution that is close to true 4K with EIS. 2.7K 30 EIS off. Now this is 2.7K 30 with the EIS on. Not really sure why you'd use this one over 1080p 30. As you'll see in a few moments, 1080p 30 EIS on is quite good. 1080p 120, no EIS setting is available. 1080p 60, EIS off. For some reason, the 60 FPS modes on this camera are not all that good, so let's see 1080p 60 with the EIS turned on. And yeah, it's quite blocky, especially when you compare it to 1080p 30 with EIS off. 1080p 30 with EIS on, which is, in my opinion, the best format this camera films at. 720p 240, there's no EIS available at this setting. 720p 120, same thing, no EIS is available. 720p 60, EIS off. And finally 720p 60, EIS on. And now let's compare some close-ups of those major formats. To start, we have 4K 60 EIS off versus 4K 60 EIS on, and this is just to show you the difference between these two formats because, yeah, obviously this camera cannot do 4K 60 with the EIS turned on. Like I said, I'm unsure why the option is even available in the menu because the results are pretty poor. 4K 60 EIS off versus 4K 30 EIS off. And here you can see the difference in detail between these two resolutions, where the camera is finding it difficult to process the higher frame rate mode and a drop in detail is present. More of the higher end cameras, like the Vantop Moment 6S for example, have about the same amount of detail in 4K 60 as 4K 30, but this one does struggle with it. 4K 30 EIS on versus 4K 30 EIS off. There's always some differences in detail between the EIS settings, and using newer camera hardware sometimes results in that difference being exaggerated, as you saw with the 60 FPS mode. Firmware is not yet perfected, so sometimes the results are not as great. However, this camera does an adequate job of both 4K 30, EIS on and off, despite some pretty visible compression noise around detail. 4K 30 EIS on versus 1080p 30 EIS on. I believe these two formats are the best formats the camera films at in terms of detail. Do note that EIS is stronger in 1080p than it is in 4K. And finally, last comparison, we have 1080p 60 EIS on versus 1080p 30 EIS on. You can see the significant drop in image quality where the frame rate is double to 1080p 60, which is really unfortunate because 1080p 60 is a format that every action camera should do, whether they're cheap or expensive, and this one just doesn't look very good overall. Here is a still photo which shows the camera sensor is more than capable of adding detail, as some of these resolutions above show. So hopefully this was helpful for you. I separated this out from my main video because some of my viewers might find it kind of bland, but if you have any questions, as always, just leave them in the comments below, like, share, subscribe. I appreciate all your support.